Ours is not a big city, but it is known around the world for the pottery that we make. Some of it is always being shipped to places far away, down the river and across the sea. But we, of course, we stay right here, making more of it, supporting our families, living our lives. Our lives are not luxurious, to say the least. Our children do not live like princes. On the other hand, they are not miserable. For them, our city is the whole world. The streets are like paths in a forest for them. They come to know their way around town when they are very little. But we do not think the streets are good playgrounds for children. It's hard to be careful when you're young and excited. So, in some neighborhoods, we now have settlement houses that enable the children to play together safely in proper surroundings and with experienced supervision. They have their own clubs and facilities for working at their hobbies. Some of their work shows surprising talent. Everyone is welcome here. There are always friends to meet and something interesting to do. A policeman is a strange sight in such a building, for trouble here is rare. Yet Patrolman Chuck Brown is no stranger. He often drops in after work to visit his young friends. Sometimes he invites himself, but tonight he was asked to come to a conference. Since he's early, there is also time for a little fun. The Reverend Dr. Blake has also come for the conference this evening. Most of the children in the neighborhood go to his church, and so he's no stranger to them either. Besides, he's an old friend of Miss Miller's, the chief social worker. As a matter of fact, he had a lot to do with helping her organize the settlement house many years ago. Chuck would rather play than confer. But it is time for the meeting to begin in Miss Miller's office.
It was good of both of you to come. It was rather short notice.
Oh, I'm always glad to come here.
I see Chuck quite often, but it seems that we only get together when some emergency arises. That's why I've asked you both to come here tonight.
Another calamity?
This time, I think we may be able to prevent one. Some time ago, Chuck brought a boy here to the settlement house for us to help, and we've been doing what we can. However, we haven't really gotten to the root of his problem. And I have a feeling if we three could get together on what should be done, we can really help this youngster.
Who is this boy?
It's the Moody boy, the eldest, Paul.
The Moody's?
Paul got involved with a group of pretty rough older boys. Chuck, why don't you start? You went at the beginning.
Well, I don't know the people as well as the Reverend does.
And so Chuck told how Paul first came to his attention. The story began naturally on the streets of the neighborhood, where 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, Chuck walked and watched. He really knew our streets and alleys, our stores and houses. He also knew the people, big and little. What's more, he liked them. His job was usually a simple one. Most of the time, he merely made sure that life was going on as usual. When something was different, even a little different, he would notice it instinctively. Those two boys smoking, they were from Birch Street, a few blocks away. They didn't usually hang around this candy store. The Moody boy, Paul, he did belong, but there was something strange in his manner that day. Nothing exactly wrong in all this, but somehow Chuck didn't like the combination. Paul was young for such company, and that day he seemed nervous and troubled by Chuck's notice. Besides, these older boys were not exactly angels. just noticed the incident. He didn't like it, but there was nothing to do about it. Not then. A week later, Chuck was on night duty. When a lady called police headquarters, she reported prowlers in the alley next to her home. 3 boys, she said. One about 13, the others about 15. She was watching them as she talked over the phone. An unknown witness to Paul's debut as a housebreaker. It was a matter of minutes before the patrol car reached the head of the alley. The policemen never even bothered to draw their guns. But they moved fast, for they knew how scarce young boys can make themselves in the dark. One policeman went after the older pair. But Chuck simply waited for his quarry to fall right into his hands. It was pitiful. Young Paul wasn't tough or insolent. There was no fight in him at all. Chuck had never picked up so docile a lawbreaker in his 5 years on the force. Paul's criminal career had had an inglorious beginning. While Chuck waited for his partner to come back, he talked to the boy, asked how he had come to be mixed up in this business. But Paul had nothing to say for himself, no excuses, no alibis. He seemed like a good boy who knew what he had done, something wrong, and was ready to pay for his mistake. That's why Chuck didn't arrest him officially. Instead, he decided to take Paul home, to give him a second chance. When Chuck talked to Mr. Moody, he made it clear that it was the last chance. But Paul's father wasn't going to allow a son of his to go very far in a life of crime. He agreed completely with what Chuck said about the boy's companions and promised to see that he changed his ways and his friends. He would take care of Paul. Chuck didn't have to worry about that. Nevertheless, as he left, Chuck had misgivings.
But that doesn't mean that there is anything really very wrong with him. He's young. He got in with a bad crowd, bad environment. These things happen. Of course, it is serious, and something has to be done about it. Get him over here. He'll change overnight.
That's just what we felt.
Yes, we felt that if we could divert his energies into more constructive channels, that we would have nothing more to worry about. But that was 6 months ago.
I made a point of passing by his house and talking to him.
So Chuck went on with the story. Mr. Moody had forbidden Paul to leave the little front yard after school. Chuck didn't like the idea of solitary confinement, so he persuaded Mrs. Moody to put Paul in his care. The youngster seemed to be trying hard to make a good impression. He was very courteous, very polite. When Chuck brought him into the settlement house, he behaved extremely well. Miss Miller was really pleased to receive such a fine youngster and told him so, before explaining how the settlement house operated. Chuck was also pleased with his afternoon's work. This was what the boy needed. Paul was made a member then and there and assigned to the junior division. For weeks after that, he came to the house every weekday afternoon. He wasn't very good at games when he started, but it didn't take him long to catch on. Soon he was one of the regulars. He was less happy, however, when the group went indoors to work with clay. It seemed like baby's work to him. But in the carpenter's shop, he really blossomed out. That was why the shop teacher soon made him his monitor, in charge of the tool chest. A master carpenter couldn't have had more respect for his craft. He knew where every little item belonged, what condition it was in, how it had been used or misused, and the other boys respected his talents. He was by far the best carpenter in the group. That was why he was put in charge of the squad that was assigned to build scenery for the junior Easter play. The shop teacher had recognized his superior skill, but by now, Paul also knew he was good. Knew it too well, in fact, and wanted to make sure that everyone else knew it. The boys who objected to his manners were quickly and firmly put in their place, in a style that didn't please them very much. But Paul was determined to show them who was boss. He didn't seem to care whether they liked him or not. In fact, the more trouble he ran into, the tougher he became. Nothing was beyond his notice. Nobody was safe. Nobody was good enough. He thought, that is. Nobody could do the job as well as he could. He admitted that to Miss Miller the day he came to report that the scenery was finished. She was busy that day. Her monthly report wasn't done, and the money had started to come in from the ticket sale. So she merely congratulated Paul on finishing the job in time and assured him that she appreciated his conscientious work. But the boys weren't so easy to square. Paul still wanted friends outside the shop, but the youngsters weren't having any of him. He had succeeded in making a name for himself, and it wasn't a nice one. He was especially hated by the smaller boys, with good reason. He never lost a chance to torment them, to prove he was bigger and stronger than they were. When they defended themselves by going after him in a group, they got into trouble with the supervisor. Paul, who was always so polite with grown-ups, always escaped unpunished. But he didn't fool the boys. And that was the situation when Miss Miller discovered that the ticket money was missing. She was ready to swear that she'd put it in her desk drawer, and she couldn't for the life of her remember taking it out. But it was not there now. That was sure. Someone had taken it. She was quite unprepared for what turned up when she began to investigate. No one had heard of the money, of course. And when she suggested that some stranger was probably responsible for the theft, the boys said maybe, but they didn't believe it. Not if Paul Moody was around. For a long time, somebody had been taking change and chewing gum out of their jacket pockets, and all signs pointed to Paul. Miss Miller resisted the idea that it might be Paul, until she suddenly remembered Paul had been right here in her office the day she put the money away in the desk. It was the day that he had complained to her about the boys on the scenery squad. Yes, she had to admit, Paul knew where the money was, but he'd seemed so preoccupied by the scenery. Or had he? Miss Miller always hated to think anything bad about her boys. But this was a suspicious situation, for Paul had stopped coming to the settlement house. He hadn't been in for 10 days. She had supposed at first that he was simply ill. But maybe there was another reason for his absence. She went to visit the Moodys next morning. Mrs. Moody was rather strange when she asked if Paul was ill. Not at all. His father had heard about theatricals at the settlement house and had forbidden Paul to go there anymore. But couldn't Miss Miller talk to Mr. Moody? She could explain. No, he'd given his orders. theatricals. It was preposterous. But the disappointing fact remained. There was nothing Miss Miller could do for Paul as long as his parents considered the settlement house a bad environment.
Why didn't you tell me about the money?
I had no real evidence, Chuck. I still don't.
Isn't that for me to decide?
In this case, no. I'm not so sure that it is. I think it's something the three of us can decide. That's why I am telling you, Chuck.
It's hopeless anyhow.
I wouldn't say that exactly. I've been thinking about what to do next. For my part, I think that I should see the boy regularly, several times a week perhaps. This calls for intensive work.
See him about what?
Give him some sense of moral responsibility. He obviously doesn't know what the word moral means.
That'll be a really difficult job. I don't think anybody in the world can tell that boy any more about moral responsibility or anything else.
What do you mean?
And so Miss Miller began the last chapter of Paul's story. Last Thursday night, the guard at the railroad yard picked up a boy and brought him into the watchman's hut down by the loading tracks. He called police headquarters to tell them about the youngster, whom he'd found in an empty freight car, trying to run away, he said. His name was Moody. Since it was Chuck the guard was talking to, the name was familiar. Yes, his first name was Paul. Chuck was down at the yard in about 15 minutes. It was the same Paul, humble, contrite, waiting for the blow to fall. No, the guard didn't want to press charges, glad to get rid of the kid. Do whatever you want with him. Chuck hadn't heard that Paul had quit the settlement house. He thought it would be a good place to talk things over. Miss Miller was still up, but neither she nor Chuck could get a word of explanation out of the boy. He wouldn't tell them why he'd run away. He wouldn't even tell them what time he'd left home. Chuck tried to reassure him. "Don't be afraid," he said. "We're your friends." Miss Miller was friendly, too, but Paul wouldn't talk. Then, suddenly, they both realized that he couldn't talk. He was as astonished and frightened by his behavior as they were. They had a very disturbed boy on their hands. Then Miss Miller had an odd idea. "Did you ever run away from home before?" she asked gently. That broke the dam. Paul began to talk about himself, or rather about his life. One story he told about his childhood was typical of many. The story began about 2 o'clock one Saturday, 6 years before. Saturday was the day he used to call for his father at the factory. This was a special privilege, permitted only if he had been well behaved all week. He was only about 7 then, and it was very exciting to be among all the factory workers. And finally, to greet his father and walk home with him like a grown-up son. Paul was proud to be allowed to walk with his father. Sometimes they would meet people on the way, like Bobby Gelfand and his father. Mr. Gelfand was his father's friend, just like Bobby was his friend. It was a nice feeling to be among friends. When they were all together like this, the town seemed to belong to him. What's more, his father let him invite Bobby to come home and play with him. This was a good Saturday. Upstairs, his mother was working in the kitchen where his baby brother, Tim, was eating his lunch. His father came right in. He'd washed up at the factory, and he was impatient for his coffee. And when his father was impatient, he had a funny way about him. His mother knew the signs, of course, but the coffee wasn't quite ready, so he would just have to wait a few minutes. She was sorry, but she'd had trouble getting Tim to eat his lunch. It was not a time for kids to hang around the kitchen. Even at 7, Paul knew what things were like when his mother was sorry about something and his father was impatient. Nobody talked, but there was something in the air. Besides, this was a good time to work on his model boat. It didn't take very long to get the tools and the wood. But Mrs. Moody hit the ceiling when she saw what was happening to the dining room. But hadn't his father said it was okay? Not in her dining room. Besides, she had to set the table for the company. The Smiths are coming tonight. Leave them alone, Mary. I gave them permission to work for a while. You have 2 full hours before you have to set the table. They'll be careful. Paul's father liked to see him working with his hands, but he said, a craftsman prepares his workspace properly. You must use your head as well as your hands. Now the space is ready. Next, you make sure that all your equipment is in proper condition for working. Paul felt that working with his father was even more of a treat than being seen with him in the street. If he listened well and learned what his father told him, who knows, perhaps someday he too would be a master mechanic and then a foreman. Mr. Moody was a strict teacher. He believed in learning things properly right from the start. A child's learning is the foundation of the man, he would say. If you pick up sloppy habits at the beginning, you would remain a sloppy workman all your life. For a little boy, Paul did quite well, but it was never really well enough to please a fine, careful workman like Mr. Moody, who liked things to be perfect. And Paul knew that his father was right when he found fault with his work. After all, a son of a foreman shouldn't be allowed to get away with careless measurements. Sometimes Paul felt he would never learn. But he tried to obey his father, no matter how many times he had to do each job over. Carpentry for him was always doing something over. That afternoon, they all worked together until 5 o'clock. Then Mr. Moody went upstairs to shave, having carefully told the boys to put away the tools and clean up the room. But they only had a little more to do to get their boat ready for launching. So, when Mother wanted the table, Paul begged for 5 minutes more. The guests were coming at 6:30, she reminded them. 5 minutes, Paul pleaded. Papa would be glad to see the boat finished. After all, it was his boat, too, and they only had the rigging to do. But time is something that moves too fast for little boys. The rigging had to be done with extra care. Now it was 6:25. But look, the boat is finished. Wrong again. Look at that mess. The Smiths are due for dinner in 5 minutes. But Father, Paul exclaimed, I thought you wanted us to finish the boat. Don't talk back to your father, do you hear? I told you to clean up over an hour ago. When will you learn to obey orders? Is this cleaning up? What about the Smiths? There they are now. You're making a fool of me in front of my friends. I'll punish you for this. Just wait. All he could do was to greet the Smiths and then apologize to them for the confusion. Had they ever seen a more disgraceful mess? That's because he had a thoughtless, disobedient loafer for a son. This is what comes from being too good to children. Now, go up to your bed and stay there. No supper for you. Do you hear? Now it was Paul who was humiliated. Humiliated and confused. Nothing made sense. Why was it wrong to finish the boat? He had only wanted to please his father, to show him that he was a conscientious workman. Why was it wrong? His mother was worried about him, but he was angry at her. So when she came to ask him how he was, he made believe he was sleeping. Besides, if he talked to her, he would probably start crying, and that would be the worst shame of all. But he couldn't sleep now, not with all that talk going on downstairs. At first, he was only going to get out of bed to peek over the railing so he could hear better and see what was going on. But he had to be careful not to wake Tim. That's what gave him the idea. If they kept on talking, he might sneak out altogether without being heard. Sending him to bed like a baby, like Tim. He'd show them. He wasn't scared because he didn't have time to think about what he was doing. He just did it. Now the noise was a blessing because it covered the squeaking of the boards when he moved. It would be terrible to be caught now. He couldn't believe he was out, safe, free to run away. Free to run away, but where to run? Where do you go when you run away? He found himself at the river, at the edge of the river that leads out to the sea. There, too, was the great bridge that led to the farms and fields. Perhaps this was the best way out of the city. But he realized that it was too big and strange, and besides, people would notice a little boy walking across an empty bridge at night. This way was closed. He decided he'd better get going. He'd find a way. It had been a mistake to stop running. Soon he was down at the docks that he knew and liked, his favorite place in the city. But you need something to ride on if you want to go places. How does a small boy get a ride at night? The old river tugboat was going just where he wanted to go. If only he could get aboard. If only there was someone to help a boy on his travels like there was in the storybooks. But boat captains don't stop for boys in real life. They go on down the river as fast as their motors and the current will carry them, under the bridges, past the cities, down to the sea. And one is left behind. Paul knew once the boat was gone that he couldn't run away, but he didn't know what he would do, for he couldn't go home either. Those mean, laughing Smiths, his angry father, his mother who always gave in. No, he would never go back. But it was too cold to stay where he was. Where could he go? In the dark, even places that you know seem strange and frightening. The docks where Paul loved to play in the daytime suddenly became a bad place to be. Even the smell of the river was unpleasant and scary. He remembered hearing stories about water rats that came up on the shore at night. They are even said to attack people when they're hungry. This was no place to hang around. And it wasn't much better when he got back to the streets. He never remembered a night that was so dark. How could those people be talking and laughing in such a place? That's because they weren't alone, because they had a place to go to. He had no friends, so he made some up. He also made up a game and played it with his make-believe friends as he walked along. Suddenly, he found himself standing in front of his school. How had he gotten there? Without thinking, he had come to the place where he usually found friends. But it was empty now. And it, too, seemed frightening and forbidding in the dark. This was no place to come for warmth and comfort, not in the night. The night is full of shadows. The ones that stand still are just as terrifying as the ones that move. Who knows when a black, evil shape will suddenly come to life? Who can tell the difference between friend and enemy in the dark? Not Paul. He decided to look for shelter and light. It was then that he thought of his playmate, Bobby, his partner in disgrace. Why not go to see him? Now Paul was not afraid. This doorway did not look so different in the dark. But it was not Bobby who came to the door. Mr. Gelfand seemed surprised at finding so young a visitor this time of night, but he was friendly. What in the world was Paul doing out so late? Bobby had been sound asleep for 2 hours. Surely his parents must be worried sick about him. And before Paul could think of what to say, Mr. Gelfand had gone to the telephone. Paul had walked right into a trap, a well-meant trap, but a bitter ending to Paul's short spell of liberty. True, his father was worried about him, but he was more angry than worried. The scolding began immediately, right in front of the Gelfands, for Mr. Moody had to prove it wasn't his fault that his son was a delinquent. Then began the homeward trip, but not without proper apologies to the kind friends who had been disturbed by this strange child. Paul remembers the walk from their home to his, the walk back from freedom. His father scolded him every step of the way. The house seemed exactly like a prison that night. His mother was glad to see him, but his father said that there was to be no coddling of bad boys. She'd been too soft all along. Now he, the father, was going to take things in hand. What Paul needed was a man's touch. It was hard on everybody in the house. But what could anyone do about it? Maybe children have to learn this way. Now the prison was complete. Paul had talked for hours that night about his childhood. There were many, many stories, but he was always the villain, the bad boy who shamed his parents. He admitted it. He always seemed to do the wrong things. What else was there to do but run away? Miss Miller thought that if she, rather than Chuck, took him home, she would get a chance to talk with Mr. Moody. Maybe she could soften his anger against his son. She started to explain who she was and why she was bringing Paul home. But Mr. Moody wasn't interested in explanations. He understood. Paul was in trouble again. Thank you, he didn't need her help. He would take care of the boy himself. Just leave it to him. But Miss Miller didn't think he could take care of the boy himself. She thought the Moodys were in serious trouble.
So now we're powerless to help Paul.
You think it's that bad?
I'm sure it's that bad. Paul is a boy that believes deep down inside of him that he's no good, that he can't be any good. Grown-ups have been telling him that all of his life. Everything that the boy does becomes a new source of humiliation, a new reason for being scolded. One scolding or two doesn't hurt. Even a slap doesn't hurt as much as the constant, endless humiliation. That's what we have to stop.
Now I understand. You want me to make the Moodys understand what they're doing to their own child.
I don't think you'll have much trouble with Mrs. Moody.
Well, Mr. Moody is a good man. He wants to be a good father. I think I could convince him.
That won't change the kid.
No, not that alone. But we could start building up his self-respect. Remember, we pushed him too hard, too. We gave him more responsibility than he could handle.
I don't like it. I should have turned that boy in at the beginning.
What do you want to do? Lock him up?
Is that different from what his father's been doing?
I'm surprised at you, Chuck. You've always been so wonderful with kids. And now when there's really a tough problem to solve, you want to give up. Don't you see if we can get the Moodys in on this? You and Margaret and me can make a team, a fighting team for this boy. You're not going to let us down.
No, Miss Miller has won. Dr. Blake and Chuck will not desert Paul now. Even though it means working after their regular hours and outside their appointed tasks, the social worker, the minister, and the policeman are working together unofficially tonight because they have a personal interest in the people of our town, the people who live in the little houses near the factories. These are the homes of the people who make our famous pottery. These are the people who also want to make good, happy families, but who are puzzled by the way the world seems changed since they were children. There are many worried fathers and mothers like the Moodys who want to do the right thing, but who are often so confused by their own feelings that they destroy those they want to help because they cannot understand them. Mr. Moody does not know that while too much softness may spoil his boy, so may too much hardness, too much discipline, too much anger. Perhaps Miss Miller, working through Dr. Blake and Chuck, will now be able to help him to understand his problem. Perhaps she can help him enjoy his role as the head of the house instead of feeling that he is the father of a bad boy. It is a bitter feeling. For in our little town by the river, we respect a good craftsman, but we honor the good parent above all.